What if one of the most controversial books connected to the Bible was not trying to replace Genesis at all, but was trying to tell you what Genesis supposedly left unsaid? What if behind the creation story you already know, behind the lives of Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses, there was another ancient voice insisting that heaven had revealed more? More about time, more about angels, more about the law, more about the hidden structure of history itself. And what if that voice was powerful enough to survive for centuries, but dangerous enough to be pushed outside the canon, accepted by most of the Christian world? Tonight, we are stepping into one of the strangest and most debated books in ancient biblical history, the Book of Jubilees, a text preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, a text often called Little Genesis, a text that retells the story of creation, the patriarchs, the flood, the covenant, and the law, but does it in a way that changes the atmosphere of everything. Because in Jubilees, history is not just history. It is scheduled, it is measured, it is written in heaven before it unfolds on earth. In this book, angels are not standing quietly at the edge of the story. They are in the machinery of the story. They teach, they guard, they judge, they deliver law, they oversee time. They move through the background of Genesis like hidden administrators of divine order. And that is where the tension begins, because once you read Jubilees, the question is no longer just, what does this book add? The deeper question becomes, why did so many communities decide these additions should not stand beside Scripture as equal authority? Was it because the book went too far? Because it pressed too hard on controversial ideas? Because it challenged the calendar, the law, and even the way people understood Moses? Or was it because it preserved a worldview so ancient, so intense, and so cosmic that later traditions could not fully carry it forward? Stay with me, because the answer is deeper than it was banned, and stronger than it was forgotten. By the end of this video, you will see why the Book of Jubilees has fascinated scholars, unsettled believers, and continued to haunt conversations about the Bible for generations. And more than that, you will see why this book was never just about missing stories. It was about authority. Who speaks for God? When did God's law really begin? Who controls sacred time? And what happens if the calendar used by most people is wrong? That is not a small disagreement. That is a direct challenge to how a community organizes worship, covenant, and truth itself. So let's begin where Jubilees begins. Not at Sinai, not with Abraham, not even with Adam. It begins with a claim that what follows was revealed to Moses by an angel while he was on Mount Sinai. That matters because the book does not present itself as folklore, legend, or religious imagination. It presents itself as revelation. In other words, Jubilees does not say, here is an old interpretation of Genesis. It says, in effect, here is what heaven wanted Moses to know about the story behind the story. And if you take that claim seriously, everything changes. Because then Jubilees is not merely expanding the Bible. It is claiming access to the heavenly archive behind the Bible. That is one reason this book has always been impossible to treat casually. You can disagree with it. You can reject it. You can call it non-canonical. But once you understand what it is claiming, you realize why it could never sit quietly in the background. It is too bold for that. So what exactly does it say? First, Jubilees retells creation, but it does so with a rhythm that feels more precise, more ordered, and more structured than the opening chapters of Genesis. Genesis tells you that God created the heavens and the earth. Jubilees agrees. Genesis tells you that God made the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Jubilees agrees, but then Jubilees leans in and says, that is not the full picture. Because according to this book, creation is not only about matter coming into existence. It is also about time being arranged. The world is not just made. It is scheduled. The seasons are not merely observed. They are ordained. The Sabbath is not simply a command given later in Israel's story. It is woven into the architecture of reality from the beginning. That may sound small at first, but it is not small at all. Because once sacred time is built into creation itself, then calendar keeping is no longer just a matter of tradition. It becomes obedience, and Jubilees is relentless on this point. According to the book, the proper year follows a precise structure, a fixed sacred order, a measured pattern that keeps feast days, Sabbaths, and holy observances aligned with divine intention. This is where one of the book's most explosive ideas enters the room, the insistence on a 364-day solar calendar. Not a calendar drifting by lunar adjustments, not a flexible system shaped by later custom, but an exact sacred framework, 52 weeks, 4 perfect divisions, a universe moving according to divine measure. Now stop there for a moment, because this is not just an ancient scheduling preference. This is a theological confrontation. If Jubilees is right, then time itself can be profaned by using the wrong system. If Jubilees is right, then worship can go off course not because people stop believing in God, but because they stop following heaven's pattern. And if that is true, then the issue is not convenience. The issue is covenant alignment. That is why the calendar debate in Jubilees is so serious. The book is not saying, we have a different tradition. It is saying, a wrong calendar leads to wrong worship. That is the kind of claim that splits communities. That is the kind of claim that makes a text dangerous. Because once a book begins judging the religious life of others at the level of sacred time, it is no longer a side note. It becomes a rival authority, and that is only the beginning. Jubilees also places angels near the front of creation's story in a much more active way than many readers are used to seeing. In this vision, angels are not only messengers occasionally appearing in moments of crisis. They are woven into the structure of heaven and earth. Some are assigned to praise, some to watch, some to govern aspects of creation, some to preserve divine order, some to mediate heavenly instruction. This matters because in Jubilees, the universe feels administrated. It feels layered, ordered, recorded, guarded. You do not just have God above and man below. You have a whole divine order in motion. And once again, the question rises, why would this trouble later communities? Because the more a text emphasizes angelic mediation, the more it can shift attention away from the simpler canonical presentation many communities prefer. Not because angels are absent from Scripture, they are not, but because in Jubilees, angels sometimes feel like the delivery system of heaven's order in nearly every major era of history. They are teaching Adam. They are involved in the transmission of law. They are present in the testing of the patriarchs. They are active in judgment. That creates a different atmosphere, a more cosmic atmosphere, a more apocalyptic atmosphere, a more mediated atmosphere. And for many readers, that was either thrilling or unsettling. Sometimes both. Now let's go deeper. because the next move Jubilees makes is even more radical. It suggests that God's law did not begin with Moses. Read that again in your mind. Not that Moses is unimportant, not that Sinai does not matter, but that the law itself, at least in its heavenly form, already existed before Sinai, already existed before the tablets on the mountain, already existed before Israel became a nation under covenant law. According to Jubilees, Adam receives commandments. Noah preserves holy practices. Abraham keeps observances that sound strikingly like later Mosaic instruction. The patriarchs are not wandering toward lawlessness, waiting for Moses to invent order. They are living under a divine pattern that heaven already knows. This is one of the deepest ideas in the whole book, and it is also one of the most controversial, because it changes the role of Moses. In the traditional biblical telling, Moses is the great covenant mediator who receives the law at Sinai in a defining historical moment. In Jubilees, Moses is still honored, but the law he receives is less like a new beginning and more like a formal unveiling of something eternally established. That is not a minor edit, that is a reframe of covenant history itself, and once you do that, several consequences follow. First, the patriarchs become more legally observant than Genesis alone would suggest. Second, the law becomes more cosmic than national. Third, the distinction between before Sinai and after Sinai begins to blur, and that blurring would have made many communities extremely cautious. Because if law is eternal, heavenly, and already binding in hidden form before Moses, then later debates about covenant, obedience, identity, and authority become much more intense. Now let's walk through the story world of Jubilees, because this is where its additions become unforgettable. When Jubilees looks at Adam, it does not stop with his creation and fall. It pushes into the idea that Adam was introduced to sacred order from the beginning. The world into which Adam is placed is not morally blank. It is already structured. Time is holy. Worship matters, purity matters, boundaries matter. This is important, because Jubilees does not imagine humanity learning holiness slowly by trial and error. It imagines humanity being given access to divine order early and then failing to keep it. That creates a sharper tragedy. Humanity is not merely immature. Humanity is disordered. And from there the book moves through Cain and Abel, Seth, and the generations that follow, always pressing the same theme. History is moral because history is measured against heaven's design. Then comes one of the darkest parts of the ancient story, the world before the flood. You already know that Genesis briefly mentions the mysterious corruption of that era, but Jubilees intensifies it. The world is not just violent. It is polluted, not just sinful, distorted, not just morally wrong, out of alignment with the created order. This is where the book's emphasis on fallen heavenly influence, corruption and lawlessness becomes especially strong. The flood, then, is not merely punishment. It is cosmic cleansing, a reset, a purging of disorder, a divine response to a world that has crossed boundaries it was never meant to cross. And here again, Jubilees is doing more than retelling a story. It is explaining the logic of judgment. The flood happens not only because humanity is wicked, but because creation itself has been twisted out of holy alignment. That is a larger claim than Genesis makes directly. And it is a claim with implications, because if evil is not just rebellion but corruption of the sacred order, then obedience becomes more than morality. It becomes participation in creation, as it was meant to be. After the flood, Jubilees presents Noah as more than a survivor. He becomes a carrier of continuity, a restarter of covenant order, a man through whom sacrifice, holiness, and divine boundaries are reaffirmed. In this telling, Noah is not simply spared, he is entrusted, and that matters because the book wants you to see a chain. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, not disconnected figures, a line of preserved order, handed down through revelation, memory, and heavenly record. That phrase, heavenly record, brings us to one of the most powerful images in Jubilees, the heavenly tablets. If you want to understand why this book feels different, you have to understand this idea. In Jubilees, much of history is not merely known by God in a general sense. It is written, recorded, inscribed, set down in heaven, events, laws, judgments, destinies, observances, again and again. The book speaks as though there is a celestial archive containing the deeper pattern of all things. This is one reason the world of Jubilees feels so intense. Nothing is random, nothing is loose, nothing simply happens. There is a written structure behind the visible story, and once that idea enters the imagination, the reader begins to feel history differently. Abraham is not just called, his role is known in heaven. Jacob is not just blessed, his path belongs to a larger design. Israel is not just wandering, its future is recorded. This gives the entire book a sense of inevitability, solemnity, and cosmic tension. But again, it also raises questions. If the heavenly tablets contain the pattern of law and history, then how should earthly communities test a text that claims to reveal what is written there? Who gets to say such a claim is authentic? Who has the authority to confirm it? And if different communities answer that question differently, canon fractures. Now enter Abraham in Genesis. Abraham is already towering. He leaves his homeland. He trusts God. He receives covenant promises. But Jubilees is not content to leave Abraham in that frame. It reaches backward into his early life and paints him as a man who resists idolatry before his public calling fully unfolds. This is one of the most dramatic expansions in the book. Abraham is not just the father of faith. He is a young rebel against false worship, a man who sees through the emptiness of idols, a man whose loyalty to the true God begins before the familiar covenant scenes. Why does that matter? Because it deepens his identity. He is not merely chosen. He is already set apart in instinct, vision, and spiritual direction. And then Jubilees does something even more significant. It presents Abraham as a keeper of divine commandments before Moses. Sabbath, sacred practice, covenantal obedience, patterns that later readers associate strongly with Mosaic law, are pushed back into patriarchal time. This is one of the book's clearest signals that it is rewriting how salvation history feels, not replacing it, reframing it. In this world, Abraham is not pre-law in the usual sense. He is living close to the law's deeper heavenly reality before it is publicly disclosed at Sinai. That idea is beautiful to some readers and deeply problematic to others. Beautiful because it makes covenant feel eternal, problematic because it risks collapsing distinctions that later theological traditions considered crucial. And then comes circumcision. In Genesis, circumcision is the sign of the covenant given to Abraham and his descendants. Jubilees agrees, but intensifies the meaning. It is not just a historical sign introduced in Abraham's lifetime. It is presented as an ordinance rooted in heavenly order. Inscribed above before practiced below, the implication is unmistakable. Covenant signs are not improvisations in history. They are earthly enactments of heavenly decree. That is classic Jubilees thinking: heaven first, earth second, record before event, order before action. Then we arrive at one of the most haunting moments in all patriarchal tradition: the binding of Isaac. Genesis already gives this story unbearable weight. But Jubilees introduces an even more charged spiritual layer by framing the test within a larger conflict involving hostile spiritual opposition. The trial is not only about Abraham's obedience in isolation. It is connected to a wider cosmic challenge. Now think about what that does to the emotional shape of the story. Suddenly the mountain is not just a mountain, it is a battleground. Abraham is not simply being tested, he is being observed. Faith is not only personal trust, it is witness in a larger spiritual contest. That is a dramatic expansion, and it tells you something about the worldview of Jubilees. This book rarely allows biblical events to remain merely human scale. Everything is part of a higher contest, a larger record, a more charged universe. The same thing happens with Jacob and Esau. Genesis gives us tension, rivalry, birthright, deception, blessing, and division. Jubilees keeps that story, but loads it with stronger language of destiny, opposition, and long-range consequence. Jacob's role appears even more deeply chosen. Esau's line appears more sharply set in tension with the chosen line. The family conflict becomes a template for later national and spiritual conflict. Again, the scale increases. That is a hallmark of this book. A household dispute becomes sacred history. A family rivalry becomes a prophetic pattern. A personal wrong becomes part of a transgenerational struggle. And then the 12 sons of Jacob are not merely born into unfolding family complexity. Their births, places, and destinies fit into divine order. The tribes are not just genealogical outcomes, they are structurally meaningful. Judah rises, Levi is set apart. Joseph's story becomes more than a rescue narrative. It becomes a piece of a written design moving Israel toward Egypt and eventually toward the Exodus. This is where Jubilees becomes especially powerful as narrative theology, because it refuses to treat events as disconnected. Joseph being sold is not only betrayal, it is movement toward a larger appointment. Egypt is not only refuge, it is stage setting. Bondage is not only suffering, it is preparation for revelation and deliverance. Does that sound familiar in biblical terms? Yes, but Jubilees gives it a much stronger sense of pre-written order. And that leads us to Moses. If there is one place where the theological ambition of Jubilees becomes unmistakable, it is here. Because the book does not diminish Sinai, but it absolutely relocates it within a bigger frame. Instead of Sinai being the origin point of law, Sinai becomes the earthly disclosure of heaven's established order. The law is not invented there, it is revealed there, and not revealed as temporary instruction alone, but as participation in something eternal. This is why the Sabbath matters so much in Jubilees. This is why festivals matter so much. This is why the calendar matters so much. Because if time itself is sacred structure, then keeping sacred time is not ceremonial decoration. It is fidelity to creation. This is also why the book's calendar argument could not remain a harmless detail. Imagine a community reading this text seriously. Imagine being told that the dates of worship are not just slightly off, but spiritually disordered. Imagine being told that what you have inherited is a drift away from heaven's own schedule. That would not merely provoke debate, it would provoke crisis. And that helps explain something important. Books do not become controversial only because they contain strange stories. They become controversial when they threaten living systems of authority and practice. Jubilees does exactly that. It touches creation. It touches law. It touches covenant. It touches angels. It touches destiny. And above all, it touches sacred time. Now let's pause and ask the question that hangs over all of this. If the Book of Jubilees was so rich, so bold, and so theologically alive, why was it excluded from the biblical canon accepted by most Jews and Christians? This is the question most people ask too early, and because they ask it too early, they usually answer it too simply. They say it was removed because someone wanted to hide the truth, or they say it was rejected because the church was corrupt, or they say it was banned because it revealed secrets too dangerous for ordinary believers. Those answers sound dramatic, but they are too thin. The reality appears deeper and more complicated. A book like Jubilees did not sit outside the canon simply because it was mysterious. It sat outside because canon is not built on mystery alone. It is built on recognized authority, communal reception, theological coherence, liturgical trust, and continuity of use. And that is exactly where Jubilees became difficult. Let's break that down first. Jubilees presents itself with enormous authority. It claims revelation tied to Moses. That is not a modest claim, but a text claiming great authority is not the same as a community universally recognizing that authority. Some ancient communities treasured this book, others did not. That difference matters. A canon forms not only through the content of a text, but through whether a worshiping community receives that text as inspired, authoritative, and fitting alongside the other books that define its faith. Jubilees had influence. It had readers. It had reach, but influence is not identical to canon. Second, the theological profile of Jubilees is unusually strong in certain directions. It emphasizes angelic mediation. It intensifies predestined structure. It presents law as pre-Mosaic in a robust sense. It insists on a specific sacred calendar. It frames reality through heavenly tablets and cosmic scheduling. For some groups, that was compelling. For others, it was too sectarian, too specialized, too tightly bound to one worldview. And that matters because canonical books usually had to function broadly in the life of a community. A text that presses one disputed system too hard may be revered in some circles and resisted in others. Third, Jubilees retells and expands existing biblical material. All. That is both its strength and its problem. Its strength, because it fills narrative gaps, answers questions, and enriches the atmosphere of familiar stories. Its problem, because it can begin to feel like interpretation stepping so close to revelation that communities are forced to decide which voice governs the other. Does Genesis rule Jubilees? Or does Jubilees tell us how Genesis should really be read? That is not a small issue. Because if Jubilees becomes the controlling lens, then the plain shape of canonical scripture starts to shift. Suddenly Adam has more law. Abraham has more ritual responsibility. Sinai becomes less beginning and more unveiling. History becomes more predetermined. Calendar becomes more central. At that point, the book is no longer supplementing the canon from the margins. It is potentially reconfiguring it. That is a major reason texts remain contested. Fourth, transmission matters. Some books circulated broadly across the Jewish and Christian worlds in ways that stabilized their authority. Others survived more narrowly or more unevenly, or in particular communities rather than across the full spectrum of worshiping traditions. The Book of Jubilees endured, but it did not achieve the same level of universal recognition across the canons that shaped most later Jewish and Christian communities. That does not make it worthless, it does not make it fake, and it does not erase its historical significance, but it does help explain why it remained influential without becoming universally canonical. Now, here is the deeper reveal. The Book of Jubilees was not excluded merely because it was strange. It was excluded, in large part, because it was too interpretively powerful, too capable of reorganizing how readers understood Scripture, too capable of relocating the center of gravity from historical revelation to heavenly pre-inscription, too capable of turning the calendar into a theological test, too capable of making angelic mediation and eternal law central interpretive categories. In other words, Jubilees was not dangerous because it was empty. It was dangerous because it was full of structure, full of claims, full of theological consequences, and communities shaping canon had to decide whether those consequences belonged inside the scriptural center or outside it. Most chose outside, some did not. That is why the book survives in one canon and not in many others. Now let me say something important here. To recognize why Jubilees was excluded is not the same as saying it has no value. That would be too simplistic. The Book of Jubilees is enormously valuable for understanding ancient Jewish thought, biblical interpretation, covenant imagination, sacred time, and the kind of spiritual worldview that shaped communities close to the world of the Second Temple period. It shows us how some ancient believers read Genesis, how they wrestled with holiness, how they thought about angels, how they understood history, how seriously they took the ordering of time, and maybe that is part of why this book still draws people in. Because even if you do not accept it as scripture, it gives you access to an ancient religious imagination that refused to see the world as casual or spiritually thin. In Jubilees, nothing is casual. Days matter, weeks matter, births matter, boundaries matter, boundaries matters, memory matters, memory matters. The unseen order matters. That kind of vision can feel intense, even overwhelming. But it can also feel strangely clarifying in a world that treats time as disposable and worship as negotiable. And maybe that is one reason modern readers keep returning to this text. Not because they want a conspiracy, but because they sense that this book is guarding an older instinct. The instinct that God's world is patterned, that holiness is not random, that human life should be aligned, not improvised. Now, is every claim in Jubilees one we should simply absorb without question? No. And this is where wisdom matters. A serious reader has to distinguish between what the canonical scriptures clearly teach, what Jubilees adds, what ancient communities inferred, and what later readers may be tempted to overstate. That distinction matters deeply, because there is a danger in sensationalizing books like this. There is also a danger in dismissing them too quickly. The wise path is narrower. You do not worship the mystery, you study it. You do not confuse influence with canon, but you also do not mistake non-canonical status for irrelevance. You ask better questions. What does this book reveal about the spiritual concerns of its world? Why was sacred time such a battlefield? Why did some communities feel that law, angels, and destiny needed stronger emphasis? What fears, hopes, and convictions produced a text like this? Those are rich questions. And when you ask them, Jubilees stops being just the banned book. It becomes a window into how ancient believers tried to hold together creation. Covenant, judgment, purity, and the hope that heaven's order could still be known on earth. That may be the most important shift of all, because many people approach texts like Jubilees wanting a secret. But the deeper gift is not secret information, it is perspective. The perspective that biblical history was not only read as memory. It was read as pattern, not only as past, but as structure, not only as story, but as revelation of how heaven and earth belong together. And that perspective helps explain why this book refuses to die. People keep finding it, keep debating it, keep arguing over it. Keep wondering whether something precious was lost when most communities left it outside the canon. And maybe part of the answer is yes, not that canonical scripture became incomplete in a broken sense, but that a certain ancient angle of vision became less familiar. A sharper focus on sacred time, a heavier emphasis on cosmic order, a more saturated awareness of heavenly administration, a stronger sense that history is written before it is lived. That angle did not disappear entirely from biblical tradition. But in Jubilees, it is concentrated. That is why the book feels so strong. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a book that is not central for most Christian canons, but impossible to ignore if you want to understand the wider world around the Bible. It leaves us with a text that expands Genesis, but also tests the limits of acceptable expansion. It leaves us with a witness from antiquity saying, the stories you know are holy, but they are even more structured, more ordered, and more charged than you realize. And it leaves us with a challenge, not necessarily to accept Jubilees as scripture if your tradition does not, but to take seriously the hunger behind it, the hunger for holiness, the hunger for order, the hunger to know that time belongs to God, the hunger to believe that history is not chaotic, the hunger to see the visible world as rooted in a deeper, invisible design. That hunger is not strange, it is deeply human, and in the best sense, it is deeply biblical. Maybe that is why books like Jubilees still move people. Because even when readers reject some of its claims, they can still feel the force of its central instinct. That heaven is not silent, that history is not random, that God's order is deeper than what appears on the surface. And maybe that is the final reason this book still matters. Not because it settles every question, but because it reminds you that the ancient world read Scripture with awe. They did not treat Genesis like a thin introduction to bigger things. They treated it like a doorway into the architecture of reality. That is what Jubilees is trying to do. Open the doorway wider, show the machinery, name the order, trace the pattern, warn the reader. Call the people back to alignment, whether you see that as revelation, interpretation, or theological expansion. One thing is undeniable. This is not a casual book. It is a book that wants to reorder your imagination, and that is exactly why it could not simply be received without resistance. Because books that reorder imagination also challenge authority. Books that redefine sacred time challenge worship. Books that relocate the law challenge covenant history. Books that claim access to heavenly tablets challenge every community to answer one unavoidable question. Do we recognize this voice as truly belonging among the books that govern us? For most communities, the answer became no. For some, the answer remained yes, and the divide itself became part of the story. So the Book of Jubilees stands in history like a closed door that still has light around its edges. Not fully forgotten, not fully embraced, not central for most, but never entirely gone, a witness from the edge, a challenge from antiquity, a reminder that the world of the Bible was larger, stranger, and more contested than many people realize. And maybe that is what makes this book so compelling, because it does not just ask, what happened? It asks, what was written in heaven about what happened? It does not just ask, what did Moses receive? It asks, what had already been established before Moses ever climbed the mountain? It does not just ask, how should we worship? It asks, what if heaven already fixed the times and earth has drifted? Those questions are powerful. And whether you end this journey convinced, cautious, or deeply curious, one thing should now be clear. The Book of Jubilees was not pushed to the edges because it lacked substance. It was pushed to the edges because its substance was too consequential, too strong, too structured, too demanding, too capable of shifting how everything else might be read. That is why it mattered. That is why it was contested, and that is why people are still talking about it. So maybe the real mystery is not simply why Jubilees was left out. Maybe the deeper mystery is why a book left out of so many canons still feels powerful enough to pull readers back in. Maybe it is because, beneath all the debates about angels, calendars, heavenly tablets, and patriarchal law, the book is pressing one central idea into the soul of the reader: that God's world has order, that holiness has rhythm, that history has meaning, and that what looks ordinary on earth may have been written in heaven long before we ever saw it unfold. If this deep dive opened your eyes, write Jubilees in the comments. And if you want more videos exploring the ancient texts, hidden traditions, and forgotten debates that shaped the world around the Bible, stay close. Because some of the most important questions in biblical history were never really about missing books. They were about which voices a community trusted enough to live by. And once you understand that, the story of the Book of Jubilees becomes bigger than exclusion. It becomes a story about canon, authority, order, and the cost of deciding which words stand at the center. And that story is still not over.